In the spring of 1945, as the Red Army thundered across the shattered Eastern Front, a wave of terror swept into the hearts of German soldiers and civilians alike. Many believed that capture by the Soviets would mean torture, rape, execution, or worse. In that dread, countless Germans, both in uniform and out of it, made a final and tragic choice. They turned their weapons or their razors on themselves rather than face what they believed awaited them. In the ruins of the Third Reich, the fear of capture became stronger than the instinct to survive. The phenomenon of German soldiers using pistols, knives, or even razors on themselves was not a simple matter of cowardice. It was born out of psychological exhaustion, propaganda-fed terror, and the collapse of every structure that once gave meaning or order to their lives. From the first days of the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, the conflict between Germany and the Soviet Union had been defined by ideological hatred and unmatched brutality. German propaganda had dehumanized the Soviets for years, depicting them as barbaric, vengeful hordes who would show no mercy if Germany were ever defeated. On the battlefield, this fear was reinforced by what German troops saw and heard: the mass reprisals, the executions, and the stories that trickled back from the front lines. The Wehrmacht's own crimes against Soviet civilians, prisoners, and Jews only deepened the sense that retribution, if it ever came, would be catastrophic. By 1944 and 1945, when the front had collapsed and the Red Army was advancing through Poland, East Prussia, and into the heart of Germany itself, that fear turned into hysteria. Entire cities fell apart psychologically before the first Soviet soldiers even appeared. Civilians fled westward in freezing conditions, clogging roads with carts, wagons, and corpses. Rumors spread faster than any army that the Russians would mutilate prisoners, rape every woman, kill the elderly, and burn towns to the ground. For many Germans, these stories felt like a death sentence, waiting to be delivered. In that environment, the idea of suicide no longer seemed unnatural. Soldiers who had fought for years began to feel there was no future left to fight for. Some officers ordered men to fight to the last bullet, while others quietly disappeared, choosing their own deaths instead. The self-inflicted injury, a shot to the hand, a cut to the arm, or a carefully aimed pistol to the head, became a grim escape from an unbearable situation. The reasons varied from man to man. For some, it was fear of capture and torture. For others, it was the shame of surrender. Many had internalized the Nazi ideal of dying for the fatherland rather than being taken prisoner, but underneath those justifications lay a simpler truth: exhaustion, despair, and hopelessness. By 1945, the German army was barely functioning. Supply lines had disintegrated, officers had lost control, communication systems were destroyed, and the men at the front had been without rest or proper food for months. The world they had known had collapsed, and in that vacuum, fear became absolute. Historical records from those final months paint a picture of total chaos. Soviet offensives swept through Eastern Europe in massive waves, crushing the remnants of German resistance. Encircled divisions were wiped out in days. The wounded lay dying without medical help. In places like East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania, German units often found themselves completely surrounded, cut off from command, and facing annihilation. It was in such moments that some soldiers turned their weapons on themselves. Pistols, easily accessible to officers and NCOs, were the most immediate tool. Others used what they had: knives, bayonets, or even shaving razors carried in their personal kits. The method mattered little. What mattered was control, the ability to choose death over what they believed would be a fate worse than death. The records of these suicides are fragmentary, often buried within larger casualty lists marked as killed in action. Some were found by Soviet troops, already lifeless, with pistols in hand. Others were left in field hospitals where blood-stained razors and knives lay beside their bodies. The panic extended far beyond the front lines. In German towns and villages, entire communities chose death as Soviet forces approached. In April and May of 1945, thousands of civilians in towns like Demmin, Neustrelitz and Berlin's suburbs took their own lives. In Demmin alone, historians estimate that between 700 and 1,200 people died by suicide over a span of just a few days. Many drowned themselves in rivers, others hanged themselves, and countless more cut their wrists or throats with razors. Families killed their own children before ending their own lives. It was an apocalypse of fear. Among them were uniformed soldiers too injured or too terrified to flee. The accounts of survivors speak of bodies floating in rivers, mothers lying beside their dead children, and soldiers still gripping their sidearms. Soviet reports written after the war described finding entire streets littered with corpses, some clearly civilians, some in uniform. For them, it was not only defeat, but complete, spiritual annihilation. Even among the professional soldiers of the Wehrmacht, the taboo against suicide began to break down. In the early years of the war, the act of taking one's own life had been viewed as weakness or cowardice. But by 1945, with the world collapsing, even senior officers accepted it as a final act of duty or pride. Generals like Hans Krebs, who served as the final chief of the Army General Staff, shot themselves in the Führer bunker as the Soviets entered Berlin. Others followed suit across Germany's dying front lines. The pattern was consistent. No hope of victory, no will to surrender, no belief in mercy. Those who had spent years commanding men to die for the Dut Reich could not face capture and interrogation. Suicide became, in their minds, a last form of control in a world that had stripped them of everything else. For lower-ranking soldiers, this same logic played out in quieter, lonelier ways. In ruined villages, men were found with slit wrists, their razors beside them. Others placed pistols under their chins after writing letters to families they would never see again. Some attempted to wound themselves to be sent home, not to die but simply to escape the slaughter. Yet their self-inflicted injuries often led to death from blood loss or infection in the field. Understanding why these men acted as they did requires more than moral judgment. It requires empathy for the psychological collapse that war creates. These soldiers had endured years of violence, indoctrination, and loss. Many had witnessed atrocities and carried unbearable guilt. The destruction of their homeland, the bombing of their families, and the collapse of everything familiar had left them mentally destroyed. By the last months of the war, many were functioning on instinct alone. Fear of the Soviets was not only physical, but existential. They saw the approaching Red Army as a force of vengeance that would erase them and everything they had known. In some ways, suicide became their final assertion of identity, a way to decide their own fate before it could be taken from them. There was also the weight of propaganda. For years, Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda had told Germans that the Bolsheviks would commit unspeakable acts if they entered Germany. When those predictions began to come true in places like East Prussia and Silesia, panic spread like wildfire. Soldiers and civilians alike saw the suicides of others and followed suit. Suicide became contagious, a psychological epidemic born from rumor, trauma, and dread. In the towns where this mass despair unfolded, the same pattern repeated. As Soviet forces approached, civilians began preparing to die. Some filled bathtubs to drown their children. Others distributed poison or sharpened knives. Priests tried to talk them out of it, but few listened. Soldiers returning from the front, injured and broken, often joined their families in death. In Demmin, bridges were destroyed to slow the Soviet advance, trapping thousands of people within the town. When the Red Army arrived, they found streets silent, filled with bodies. The air smelled of burning and decay. Survivors recalled the rivers clogged with corpses, some still clutching weapons or bloodied razors. This was not a single isolated event, but one among dozens of similar tragedies that took place across Germany's eastern provinces. For historians, reconstructing these events is extremely difficult. Records were destroyed in the final weeks of the war. Many suicides were lumped into general casualty figures, or left unrecorded entirely. After the war, both East and West Germany avoided discussing them openly. In East Germany, under Soviet influence, the topic was politically dangerous. Acknowledging that so many people killed themselves out of fear of the Red Army contradicted the official narrative of liberation. Families of the dead often hid the truth out of shame. Only decades later, after reunification, did researchers begin to gather testimonies and uncover burial sites. Even now, the full number of suicides across Germany in 1945 may never be known. Estimates suggest tens of thousands of civilians and an unknown number of soldiers took their own lives, but the real total may be far higher. The specific image of soldiers using razors and pistols on themselves has survived partly because it is so vivid and tragic. In reality, razors were often used by civilians, particularly women and older men who did not have firearms. Soldiers, if they possessed pistols, preferred the quicker and more certain method of a gunshot. Still, in field conditions where ammunition ran out or noise could attract attention, a razor or knife offered a grim alternative. Personal shaving kits were common in every soldier's pack, and in those final days, such a tool could become a weapon against oneself. The method varied, but the motivation was always the same: terror, loss of hope, and the desire to escape. The scenes that followed such acts were horrific. In barns, bunkers, trenches, and ruined houses, comrades would find their fellows dead, throats or wrists cut, weapons by their sides. Many left notes saying only "I could not go on," or "better this than the Russians." The psychology behind these actions is now well understood by historians and psychologists studying wartime behavior. When individuals are pushed to absolute hopelessness, when there is no authority, no safety, and no belief in survival, self-destruction can appear rational. These soldiers were not only fighting an external enemy, but also their own crumbling minds. The constant shelling, sleepless nights, freezing cold, starvation, and witnessing friends die broke down every defense mechanism. Many suffered what we now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress and depressive breakdowns. In that mental state, suicide felt like release. The sense of honor and duty ingrained by Nazi ideology only reinforced the act. They had been taught that surrender was shameful, that to fall into enemy hands was to betray the fatherland. By taking their own lives, they believed they were maintaining dignity in death that they could no longer achieve in life. As the war ended and the Third Reich fell, suicides continued in staggering numbers. In Berlin alone, thousands ended their lives in April and May 1945. Families poisoned themselves in basements while Soviet shells exploded above. Hitler himself, the architect of the war, killed himself in his bunker with a pistol to the head. Goebbels and his wife murdered their children and then committed suicide. All across Germany, from small villages to military headquarters, the same scene played out. Men who had spent years believing in their nation's supremacy now saw nothing but ruin. Their leaders were dead or fleeing. The empire they had fought for no longer existed. For many, death was the final act of loyalty, or the only escape from unbearable shame. After the war, the subject of these suicides was almost erased from public memory. Survivors spoke little about them. In the Soviet zone, the topic was politically forbidden. The East German state promoted the narrative that the Red Army had liberated the people, not terrified them. In the West, discussions of suicide were drowned by the larger moral reckoning over Nazi crimes. For decades, The image of the German soldier as both perpetrator and victim was too complicated to confront, but as archives opened and witnesses aged, more accounts emerged. They revealed not just statistics but human stories, diary entries, farewell letters, photographs and burial records that spoke of entire families and military units who chose death together. What emerges from this history is not a simple tale of cowardice or fanaticism, but a human tragedy on a scale few wars have ever produced. The razor and the pistol were tools, but what they represent is deeper. The moment when fear and despair become stronger than survival. The soldiers who turned those weapons on themselves were not only ending their lives, they were ending their connection to a world that had already collapsed around them. Some believed they were sparing their families from horror. Others were simply unable to go on. In every case, these acts reveal the darkest reaches of human experience when civilization itself disintegrates. As the Red Army advanced into Berlin, the last pockets of German resistance disintegrated. In cellars and trenches, men whispered farewells and fired their last bullets, some at the enemy, others at themselves. The streets of the capital were filled with the smell of death, not just from fighting, but from thousands who chose suicide. In the following weeks, Soviet troops reported finding entire neighborhoods where residents had killed themselves en masse. Their reports, though often understated, speak of a haunting silence that hung over the fallen city. And as peace returned to Europe, the memory of those deaths was quietly buried under the rubble of reconstruction. Even today, the question remains, why did so many choose this path? The answer lies in the combination of propaganda, guilt, trauma, and fear. German soldiers and civilians alike believed that the Soviets would treat them as they themselves had treated the people of the East. In a way, they were haunted by their own crimes. The fear was not only of vengeance, but of justice. And in that fear, thousands decided to judge themselves first. It is one of the most disturbing consequences of total war, that an entire society can reach a point where death feels like salvation. In the end, the phenomenon of German soldiers using razors and pistols on themselves during the Soviet advance stands as one of the most tragic and revealing episodes of the Second World War. It exposes the collapse of morality, the devastating power of propaganda, and the fragility of the human mind under absolute terror. Whether in a bunker near Berlin, a farmhouse in East Prussia, or a frozen trench in Silesia, the image of a soldier turning his weapon on himself captures the essence of Germany's final defeat. It was not just a military collapse, but the death of an entire worldview. For every man who took his own life, there was a story of fear, disillusionment, and despair, the echo of a nation that had destroyed itself long before its enemies reached its gates. When we look back today, those final acts are not only reminders of human fragility, but also warnings. They show what happens when hatred and ideology strip away empathy, when entire populations are trapped between guilt and terror, and when survival itself becomes meaningless. In the ruins of Germany in 1945, the sound of a single gunshot or the sight of a bloodied razor told the story of a war that had consumed its creators. It was the final chapter in a tragedy written not just in history books, but in the silence of those who could no longer bear to live with what they had seen.